Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The night of July 16th, 2026, began like countless others in the working-class neighborhood of southwest Memphis, Tennessee, where modest houses line quiet streets and porch lights burn against the darkness as small guardians of ordinary lives. On Travis Road, in the 3000 block, one house held a family trying to hold itself together the way so many families do. A mother working long hours, a home that needed watching, and a child left, if only briefly, to navigate the space between innocence and the adult world creeping in at its edges. By morning, that house would be marked by police tape, and a name that had never before touched the record of violent crime would enter it permanently. That name was Kendra Scott. She was 36 years old, a mother trying to protect her children in a city where danger sometimes wears an unfamiliar face and knocks quietly rather than kicking down a door. What happened inside her home that night would raise questions that reach far beyond the four walls of a single bedroom. Questions about fear, about the fierce and sometimes uncontrollable instinct to protect a child, about the razor-thin and legally consequential line between a mother's love and the taking of a life. The events did not begin with sirens or shouting. They began with something disturbingly mundane. A young man being led into a house by a girl who was home alone. It was around 1 a.m. when a young man named Rodarius Morton, 20 years old, was invited inside. The details of how he came to be there, what words were exchanged, what understanding existed between him and the girl who opened the door, remain contained within the language of the affidavit and the ongoing investigation. But what is clear is that a threshold was crossed that should not have been crossed, in the deep hours of the night, in a household where a mother was still out. Half an hour later, at approximately 1:30 a.m., Kendra Scott came home. She did not simply walk through her front door. According to accounts relayed by police, she arrived to find something wrong immediately, something that unsettled the quiet rhythm of a house that should have been sleeping. She began banging on her own front door, calling out, demanding to know who was inside her home. "Who's at my house?" she reportedly shouted, her voice cutting through the stillness of a residential street at 1:30 in the morning, a mother's alarm sharpening into something more urgent with every unanswered second. Imagine that moment stretched out. A woman standing on her own porch, in her own driveway, fists against a door that separated her from her children, her mind racing through every terrible possibility a parent can imagine in the dark. The house did not answer immediately. Whatever was happening inside, whatever careful silence was being kept, it did not resolve itself in time to stop what came next. When Kendra Scott finally made her way inside, she went to find her children, as any parent would, moving quickly and instinctively toward the rooms where her family slept. In her daughter's bedroom, she made a discovery that would reshape all of their lives in an instant. Underneath the bed, hidden in that most childlike of hiding places, a place associated in every household with games and shadows and the imagination of children, was a grown man. Rodarius Morton, 20 years old, was found beneath her daughter's bed. There is something uniquely disturbing about that image, something that transcends the ordinary vocabulary of home invasion or trespass. A child's bedroom is supposed to be the safest room in the house, a space of stuffed animals and night lights and the small architecture of growing up. To find a stranger, an adult stranger, concealed in that space, is to have the foundation of safety pulled out from beneath a parent's feet in the space of a single glance. She had apparently spoken to her daughter on some earlier occasion, warning her about what would happen if she ever found a boy inside the house uninvited. It was not an abstract fear. It was a boundary she had drawn verbally ahead of time, perhaps sensing the vulnerabilities that come with raising a daughter in a world that does not always respect the walls parents try to build around their children. Now that boundary had been crossed in the most literal way imaginable, a body concealed beneath a child's bed frame in the hour when the household should have been at its most peaceful. Kendra Scott's reaction, once she found Morton, was immediate. She told him to leave her house. The kind of words that come from a place of fury and fear intertwined, the reflexive language of a parent whose deepest anxiety has just materialized in physical form in front of her. Morton, for his part, appears to have complied, at least in that moment. He began to leave. He made his way out of the bedroom, through the house, toward the front door, and out onto the porch. It was there, as he was exiting the home, no longer inside the house, no longer standing over the daughter's bed, that the confrontation reached its fatal conclusion. But as Morton stepped onto the porch, Kendra Scott shot him in the back of the head. The image is difficult to hold steady in the mind. A young man, having been discovered, having been ordered out, in the physical act of leaving, of putting distance between himself and the house, was struck by a bullet fired from behind. He did not survive. Officers responding to the scene at approximately 1:45 to 1:50 a.m. found him with a gunshot wound. He was pronounced dead where he lay. When police arrived and began to piece together what had happened, they spoke with Kendra Scott directly at the scene. Her explanation, delivered in the raw immediacy of those first minutes after the shooting, was simple and unadorned. She told them she had seen a man under her children's bed. And then she said the words that would follow this case through every headline and every conversation that has surrounded it since. I did what I had to do. There is enormous power in that sentence and enormous ambiguity too. I did what I had to do is the kind of phrase that can be spoken by a person who genuinely believed, in the chaos of the moment, that violence was the only path available to protect her child. It can also be the phrase of someone whose actions, however emotionally understandable, cross the boundary the law draws around the use of deadly force. The law in Tennessee, as in most states, distinguishes sharply between force used to prevent an ongoing threat and force used against someone who is already retreating, already leaving, already no longer posing an immediate danger. Morton was on the porch. He was going. And it was at that point, according to the account given by investigators, that the fatal shot was fired. This is the crux of the tragedy that unfolded on Travis Road. A mother's protective instinct, activated by every legitimate parental fear, meeting the cold architecture of criminal law at the exact moment the danger appeared, at least in the eyes of investigators, to have already passed. Grand juries and courts exist precisely to sit inside that ambiguity, to weigh the terror of the moment against the calculus of what a reasonable person should have done, and to determine where legal responsibility falls when a life is taken under circumstances that are neither purely defensive nor purely aggressive. Memphis police officially announced that an arrest had been made in connection with the homicide in the 3000 block of Travis Road. Kendra Scott, 36, was charged with first-degree murder and with employing a firearm during the commission of a dangerous felony. These are not minor charges. First-degree murder in Tennessee is among the most serious offenses on the books, associated with premeditation and a deliberate intent to kill, carrying the possibility of life imprisonment or, in aggravated circumstances, the death penalty. The additional weapons charge compounds the legal jeopardy Scott now faces, layering a mandatory sentencing enhancement onto whatever penalty may follow from the murder charge itself. For investigators, the decision to charge first-degree murder rather than a lesser offense, such as manslaughter, suggests that the physical evidence, particularly the location of the gunshot wound to the back of Morton's head as he was walking away, weighed heavily against any claim of imminent self-defense. In cases where a homeowner shoots an intruder who is still inside the residence, still advancing, still representing an active threat, Tennessee law and public sentiment alike tend to lean toward viewing the shooter as a victim protecting their home, as has happened in other Memphis area cases where residents faced no charges at all after shooting people breaking into their homes. But the geography of this shooting, A man already outside, already departing, already having been ordered to leave and apparently complying, shifted the narrative in the eyes of the law from defense to something the state now characterizes as an unlawful killing. Memphis police noted, in the language of their public statement, that this arrest contributed to the department's ongoing homicide clearance efforts, describing an 82% clearance rate for solved homicides in the city. It is a statistic meant to reassure a community that violence does not go unanswered, but it sits uneasily alongside the human wreckage left behind. A young man dead at 20, a mother facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison, and a daughter who will carry the memory of that night for the rest of hers. It is easy, in the retelling of a case like this, to focus entirely on the drama of the confrontation and lose sight of the two families whose lives were permanently altered in the space of a few minutes. Roderius Morton was 20 years old. Whatever brought him into that house in the early hours of the morning, whatever understanding he believed he had with the young woman who let him in, he was somebody's son, somebody's friend, a young man with a future that ended abruptly on a porch in southwest Memphis. His family has not, based on available reporting, spoken publicly in detail about who he was outside of the circumstances of his death, but the fact of his youth alone, 20 years old, insists that his story cannot be reduced to the label of intruder without acknowledging the fullness of a life cut short. On the other side stands Kendra Scott, a mother who, by every account given so far, was reacting to what she perceived as the worst possible violation of her home and her child's safety. Whatever a jury eventually decides about the legality of her actions, there is no reasonable dispute that she was operating, at least initially, out of visceral parental fear. The image of banging on her own front door in the middle of the night, shouting to know who was inside, is not the image of a calculating aggressor. It is the image of someone terrified for her children. And then there is the daughter, whose age has not been publicly disclosed by police, who was present in the house that night, who apparently let Morton inside, and who gave her own account to investigators describing what had happened before her mother arrived home. She now carries the burden of having been, however unintentionally, at the center of a chain of events that ended in a man's death and her mother's arrest. Whatever the courts eventually determine, this young girl will grow up shaped by a single night in ways that no legal verdict can fully address. Kendra Scott remains charged with first-degree murder and the associated firearm offense, with her case moving through the early stages of the Tennessee criminal justice system. The path ahead will likely involve a preliminary hearing, potential grand jury proceedings, and if the case proceeds to trial, a jury tasked with the unenviable job of reconstructing, from testimony and forensic evidence, exactly what happened in those critical seconds between the moment Morton stepped onto the porch and the moment the shot was fired. Defense attorneys in similar cases have often argued that a parent's belief in ongoing danger does not evaporate the instant a threat turns to flee, particularly in the charged, adrenaline-soaked seconds following the discovery of an intruder in a child's bedroom. Prosecutors, meanwhile, will likely lean on the physical evidence, a wound to the back of the head, a victim in retreat, to argue that whatever fear justified confronting Morton did not extend to justifying his killing once he was leaving. It is a case that will test how far the law is willing to stretch the concept of self-defense when the person defending home and child does not stop the moment the danger begins to withdraw. Cases like this rarely resolve cleanly in the public imagination because they sit at the intersection of two truths that refuse to cancel each other out. That a mother's fear for her child was real and profound, and that the law draws firm lines around when deadly force may be used, lines that do not bend simply because the underlying emotion was sincere. The story of Kendra Scott is, in the end, a story about what happens when those two truths collide inside the walls of an ordinary home on an ordinary street, in the space of a few terrible minutes just after midnight, and about the long, uncertain road that now stretches ahead for everyone the collision touched. Story 2. There is a quiet that settles over a marriage right before it breaks, a quiet that those living inside it rarely recognize until it is far too late to matter. In the spring of 2010, in a modest brick house on Saunders Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee, that quiet had already taken hold, though almost no one outside the walls of that house understood how deep the cracks had grown. Inside lived a young couple who, from a distance, looked like a story worth envying. A police officer husband, a beautiful young wife, a new house, a shared history that stretched back to their teenage years working the counter together at a Chuck E. Cheese. By the evening of March 16, 2010, that story would end in blood on a living room sofa, and the search for the truth of what happened there would consume a courtroom, a family, and a city for years to come. Sherry Monique Bethel and Dion Lamont Cartmail knew each other before either of them understood what love was supposed to cost. They met in high school in Nashville, trading glances and jokes across a fast food counter, the kind of early flirtation that feels inconsequential until, years later, it turns out to have been the beginning of everything. Dion enlisted in the Marine Corps in 2004, and by November 2005 he had deployed overseas for 4 months. When he returned to Nashville that spring to visit family, fate placed him and Sherry in the same shopping mall, and the two exchanged phone numbers, rekindling something that distance had only interrupted, never extinguished. What followed was a long-distance romance conducted across hundreds of miles, Dion stationed at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, Sherry remaining in Nashville with her mother, Charlotte Barber. On Valentine's Day of 2007, Dion proposed, and by August of that same year, the two were married. It was, in many ways, a young love story built on history and hope, the kind that promises permanence simply because it has already survived so much distance and time. But marriages built on distance often reveal their fault lines only once the couple is finally living under one roof. Sherry did not immediately join Dion in North Carolina. She stayed behind with her mother, and later the two rented an apartment together in Nashville while Dion remained stationed away. In May 2008, Dion was honorably discharged from the Marines due to a medical disability, and by that fall he had been hired by the Metro Nashville Police Department, entering the police academy and graduating in July 2009. That same year, the couple bought a house together on Saunders Avenue, the home where, within months, everything would come apart. Inside that house, Dion Cartmail kept an extraordinary number of firearms close at hand, personal weapons, police-issued service weapons, a 9mm Glock that he called his favorite sidearm, and the very first handgun he had ever owned, along with a rifle and a police-issued shotgun locked away in a gun safe inside the master bedroom closet. He carried a weapon everywhere, on duty and off, a habit so ingrained that Sherry had grown used to a home where guns were simply part of the furniture. In the spare bedroom, Dion had built what he called a ballistics lab, a trauma plate torn from a bulletproof vest propped against old tires, a makeshift shooting range where he would fire rounds from a single foot away, sometimes with Sherry and their friends joining in. There had already been a warning, months before the fatal night. Sometime in January or February of 2010, a gun discharged accidentally inside the house. Dion told police the bullet had gone through the mattress, through the bed's footboard, through a wall, and struck his subwoofer system before finally stopping. Friends of the couple later gave conflicting accounts of who had actually fired that shot. Some friends recalled Sherry admitting she had accidentally pulled the trigger. Others, including her close friend Stephanie Lindblom, refused to believe that story at all, insisting Sherry would never play around with a weapon and would have told Dion, not the other way around, to put the guns away. Sherry's mother later discovered a second bullet hole, this time in a bathroom wall, when she visited the house just days before her daughter's death. And when she asked what had happened, Sherry showed her the hole in her mattress, but would not say who had fired the gun. Beneath the surface of guns and near misses ran a deeper and more troubling current, money. The Cartmails lived, in Dion's own later words, paycheck to paycheck. Bills went unpaid. A $600 utility bill nearly went into default while Sherry was traveling out of state, forcing Dion to dip into money set aside for their mortgage. On March 11, 2010, just 5 days before Sherry's death, An argument over that borrowed money erupted at her workplace, Skyline Medical Center, where she worked at the front desk. Security cameras captured Dion storming into the emergency room, demanding money and shouting that he was tired of playing games. A coworker, Stephanie Lindblom, remembered Sherry being humiliated in front of her colleagues, and remembered receiving a hurried email from her friend that read simply, "Don't leave me up here with this nut." After the argument, Sherry reportedly told Lindblom that if Dion wanted a divorce, it was his for the taking. There were other threads tightening around the marriage that spring. Sherry's wedding ring had vanished sometime in the preceding months, a loss she had described to friends as genuinely devastating, since she loved that ring deeply. And unbeknownst to her, Dion had been carrying on flirtations and text message exchanges with several other women, including a woman named Megan Prisco, whom he had met at a gas station and visited on weekends, telling her that his wife wanted everything top of the line, and confessing he wished he had met Prisco first, despite the fact that all three of them, Dion, Sherry, and Prisco, had attended the very same high school. Records later showed Dion had driven to Prisco's home 14 times in the weeks before Sherry's death, using his patrol car and sometimes traveling outside his assigned zone to do it. He had also exchanged messages with another woman the night before Sherry died. Perhaps most chilling of all was a conversation Sherry reportedly had with her mother around Christmas of 2009. She told Charlotte Barber that she could not have children with Dion, because he had warned her that if she ever left him, he would kill her, their baby, and himself rather than pay child support. When Charlotte later confronted Dion directly and asked if he had said those words, he simply turned and walked away without answering. March 16, 2010, began without any obvious sign that it would be Sherry's last day alive. Security footage from Skyline Medical Center placed her at the nurse's station at 3:48 in the afternoon, still going about the routine motions of an ordinary workday. She continued through the admissions area until around 4:15 or 4:20 p.m., stopped briefly in a colleague's office to discuss paperwork for a new position within the hospital, and left that office at 4:32 p.m., telling a supervisor she was heading home to get ready for an evening out with her friend Stephanie. A hospital employee saw her outside the office at 4:30. She walked to her car in the employee lot, a walk time at 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and drove home. By the timeline investigators would piece together, Sherry arrived home sometime around 4:40 p.m. The emergency call reporting her shooting came in at 4:46 or 4:47 p.m., meaning she had been inside her own house, alive, for perhaps 10 minutes before the gun went off. In that impossibly narrow window, Dion would later claim an entire sequence of events had occurred. Sherry arriving home, the two of them reviewing gun safety together, disassembling a handgun in the living room, Sherry asking what to make for dinner, walking to the kitchen to season chicken, returning to sit beside him, and beginning to watch the movie Training Day together, all before the fatal shot rang out. Detective Charles Robinson, running the numbers again and again, could not make the timeline fit. 10 minutes was simply not enough time for all of it. When Nashville Fire Department crews arrived at the house on Saunders Avenue, they found Sherry lying on the living room sofa, unresponsive, without breath, without a pulse. She was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, but there was nothing left to save. She had been shot once, a bullet entering through the right side of her face, passing through her cheek and skull, and exiting the back left side of her head. She was 24 years old. Dion told the first responders that he had been in the kitchen when he heard the gunshot. Later, speaking to a police chaplain sent to help notify Sherry's family, his story shifted. He said the two of them had been together in the living room handling weapons, that Sherry wanted to dry fire a gun, that she had set it down to check on the chicken cooking in the oven, and that he had reloaded the gun and carried another weapon, the AR-15, back to the bedroom, only to hear the fatal shot while he was out of the room. In a recorded interview with detectives the following day, the story shifted once more. Now he said he had been reaching for the AR-15 directly beside Sherry, felt the bang, and the force of the shot at nearly the same moment, and turned to find her already collapsed. Investigators noticed the inconsistencies almost immediately. Detective Robinson observed blood spatter patterns that did not match an accidental self-inflicted shooting, and he grew more suspicious the more he listened to Dion's shifting account. Crime scene photographs told their own story. Blood transferred across doorways throughout the house, a heavy stain soaked into the living room sofa, blood smeared on the front door and its handle, bloodied rags scattered across the floor and an ottoman, a 9mm pistol resting on that same ottoman beside a spent cartridge casing. Dion himself had blood on his hands, his face, and his jeans, and he had been wearing a dark hooded jacket over a white shirt, a jacket he was no longer wearing by the time officers arrived, even though he insisted he had been wearing it at the moment of the shooting. For weeks, investigators worked quietly, testing gunshot residue, sending blood spatter evidence to a specialist in Georgia, and interviewing everyone who had known the couple. Forensic pathologist Dr. John Davis initially listed Sherry's cause of death as undetermined, waiting for more evidence before deciding whether it was accident or homicide, a decision he ultimately said belonged to a jury. His examination revealed telling physical details. Stippling on Sherry's skin indicated the gun had been fired from a distance of roughly 6 to 9 inches away, and the angle of the wound suggested the shooter would have needed to fire from below her face if taller than she was. Crucially, Dr. Davis noted that if Sherry had truly been gripping the gun by its slide, as Dion's account implied, her hands should have shown lacerations from the recoil. They did not. Bloodstain pattern analysts reached even more damning conclusions. Jerry Finley, brought in from Statesboro, Georgia, determined that the marks on Sherry's arm showed it had been raised at the moment of the shot, and that her open left palm bore impact stains inconsistent with her holding a gun outward toward her own face. Dion, meanwhile, had impact spatter across his nose and mouth and back spatter on his shirt, patterns consistent with him facing Sherry directly at the moment the trigger was pulled. No blood evidence supported his claim that he had carried an AR-15 to the bedroom afterward, and no evidence supported his claim of performing CPR. A second expert, Michael Maloney, arrived at similarly precise conclusions. Sherry had been seated on the couch, Dion beside her and slightly to her right, leaning toward the ottoman, the gun no more than 3 to 9 inches from her cheek when it fired. Beyond the forensic details lay the more human evidence, the testimony of the people who had known this couple best. Sherry's sister, Antoya Brandon, described visiting the home with her young daughter and asking Dion to remove a gun left casually on the ottoman, only for him to snap back that it was his house and everyone could leave if they did not like it. A police training officer recalled Dion joking about deceiving his wife if he wanted to see other women. And in the hours after Sherry's death, rather than grieving in seclusion, Dion called the hospital and Metro's Human Resources Department to inquire about life insurance benefits, a detail investigators found deeply unsettling, given that he later applied to collect on a $23,000 policy, a sum that would double to $46,000 if her death was ruled accidental. On May 28, 2010, a little over 2 months after Sherry's death, a grand jury indicted Dion Cartmail, charging him with first-degree murder. Metro Police had already decommissioned him from duty while the investigation unfolded. Sherry's mother, Charlotte Barber, spoke to reporters in the aftermath with a grief that mixed devastation and determination in equal measure, saying it was settling in that her daughter was truly gone and that she trusted justice would eventually be served. The trial began in August 2011, drawing intense local attention, since a Nashville police officer standing accused of murdering his own wife struck at something the public found difficult to reconcile. A man sworn to protect, now accused of the opposite. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard the full portrait investigators had assembled, the shifting stories, the forensic contradictions, the financial desperation, the hidden relationships, the missing wedding ring, the chilling remark about killing Sherry rather than paying child support. Dion took the stand in his own defense, testifying that his memory of the shooting itself was very fuzzy, and that he simply was not going to sit and try to relive it. He denied ever threatening Sherry, admitted to the affairs and crude behavior, admitted calling her degrading names in anger, but insisted to the end that her death had been a tragic accident, that she had been the one holding the gun when it discharged. The jury did not believe him, at least not entirely. On August 26, 2011, they convicted Dion Cartmail not of first-degree murder, but of second-degree murder, concluding that while premeditation could not be firmly established, the killing was neither accidental nor self-inflicted. On October 7, 2011, Judge Randall Wyatt sentenced him to 18 years in prison, 3 years above the 15-year minimum for the offense. Dion appealed, arguing the trial court had allowed improper testimony about Sherry's private statements to friends and family, and that his sentence had been unfairly enhanced. In July 2014, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals acknowledged that some of that testimony had indeed been improperly admitted, but ruled the errors harmless, in light of the overwhelming forensic and circumstantial evidence against him, and upheld both his conviction and his sentence. Long after the courtroom emptied, what remained was the quieter, more permanent damage. A mother who had buried her 24-year-old daughter, a sister who would never forget the sound of Dion telling her to get out of his own house, and a community forced to reckon with the unsettling truth that the badge meant to represent protection had, in this case, concealed something far darker. Sherry Cartmail's story endures today not simply as a case study in forensic science and courtroom strategy, but as a reminder of how easily the warning signs inside a marriage, missing rings, hidden text messages, holes in mattresses explained away as accidents, can be dismissed by those closest to the danger, until it is too late for anyone to intervene at all. Story 3. Rio de Janeiro shimmered under a hard summer sun in 2009, the kind of light that made the ocean look like hammered silver and made everything, even sorrow, seem temporarily bearable. In a modest apartment far from the glass towers of Barra de Tijuca, a young woman named Eliza Silva Samudio was rebuilding her life piece by piece, the way a person rebuilds a house after a storm has taken the roof clean off. She was 24 years old, striking, with the kind of face that photographers like to frame in golden hour light, and she carried herself with the guarded optimism of someone who had already survived more than her share of hardship. Born on February 22, 1985, in the border town of Foz do Iguaçu, Eliza's earliest years had been shaped by absence. Her parents separated when she was only 6 months old, her mother leaving her in her father's care after enduring violence in the marriage and struggling to provide for her financially. For a while, mother and daughter were strangers connected only by blood, reunited briefly when Eliza was 10 and living with her mother in Campo Grande, before she returned once more to her father's house. It was a childhood defined by movement and impermanence, the kind that leaves a person hungry for stability and sometimes dangerously willing to chase after anyone who promises it. By 13, Eliza had already decided what she wanted from life. She dreamed of the runways of Rio and Sao Paulo, of the flashing cameras and the glamour that seemed, from the vantage point of a small border town, like a doorway into a different existence entirely. At 18, she packed her hopes into a suitcase and moved to Sao Paulo alone, knowing no one, with barely enough money to survive. The city did not open its arms to her the way she had imagined. To make ends meet while she searched for modeling work, she took jobs that paid quickly but cost her socially and emotionally, eventually working in the adult entertainment industry under the name Fernanda Farias, appearing in editorials, fashion shows, and films between 2005 and 2009. It was not the life she had envisioned as a girl staring at magazine covers, but it was a life, and she clung to it while still reaching, quietly, for something more legitimate and lasting. It was against this backdrop, sometime in 2008 or 2009, that Eliza's path crossed with that of Bruno Fernandes das Dores de Souza, a man the whole country knew simply as Bruno. He was not an ordinary man. He was the goalkeeper and captain of Flamengo, one of the wealthiest and most beloved football clubs in Brazil. a man whose gloves had stopped shots in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans, whose face appeared on billboards, whose name alone opened doors that remained forever closed to people like Eliza. He told her they met at a party in Rio de Janeiro, at the home of a fellow player, where, by his own account, they had sex the very night they met. What followed felt, to Eliza, like the beginning of a love story. Bruno was already married, with 2 daughters, but he told her he intended to leave his wife for her. He asked her to step away from film work, and she agreed, choosing to believe that this was the start of a different chapter, one built around him. For a few months, they moved through the world together in the careful, half-hidden way that affairs unfold, meetings arranged, secrets kept, promises exchanged in private rooms far from the stadium lights. Then, in August 2009, everything shifted. Eliza discovered she was pregnant. When she told Bruno, he did not respond with excitement or tenderness. He asked her to have an abortion. She refused. And in that refusal, the fragile architecture of their relationship began to collapse. What happened next should have been a turning point that the justice system caught and held on to. Instead, it became the first of many moments when the system looked away. On October 13, 2009, Eliza walked into a police station and reported that she had been held against her will the day before by Bruno and 2 of his associates, men known by the nicknames Russo and Macareo. She said they had forced her to swallow substances meant to induce a miscarriage. She said they had beaten her. She said that Bruno had held a gun to her head. These were not vague accusations. They were specific, harrowing, and, as later evidence would confirm, substantially true. Bruno's response to the accusations was to attack her credibility in public. He released a statement calling her claims lies, insisting that she was chasing fame at his expense, and declaring that he would only speak through his lawyer from that point forward. It was the classic maneuver of a powerful man facing an inconvenient truth. Discredit the messenger before the message can be examined. For a time, it worked. A delegate did order him to stay at least 300 meters from Eliza, a small and largely symbolic protection. But when Eliza sought something stronger, a formal restraining order, a judge named Ana Paula Del Duque Miguez Laviola de Freitas denied it, reasoning with chilling technicality that Eliza did not have a stable, intimate relationship with Bruno recognized under the law meant to protect women from domestic violence, and that granting the order might trivialize that law's purpose. The judge did not weigh in her ruling that Eliza was 5 months pregnant at the time, carrying a child that Bruno himself had fathered. Eliza did not have the abortion. On February 10, 2010, in Sao Paulo, she gave birth to a son. Bruno refused to acknowledge that the child was his, publicly accusing Eliza of trying to trap him for his money, a cruel and dismissive phrase that reduced motherhood to extortion. Eliza, undeterred, moved to Rio de Janeiro with her infant, living in hotels that Bruno was paying for, and filed a paternity claim in court. She began demanding child support. She pressed forward with the assault case against him as well, and Bruno was formally indicted over the October 2009 incident. For a few months, Eliza held the fragile position of a woman fighting a famous, wealthy man through the legal system, armed with nothing but persistence and the truth. It is worth pausing here to imagine what her days must have looked like. A young mother, not yet 26, navigating a legal system that had already failed her once, caring for an infant son, likely isolated from many of the people who might once have supported her, and facing a man with the money, the fame, and the connections to make her struggle look, to much of the public, like the desperate scheme of an opportunist, rather than the legitimate claim of a wronged mother. Yet she did not stop. She kept showing up. She kept demanding recognition, both for herself and for her son. In June 2010, something changed. Bruno reached out with what appeared to be an offer to settle. He invited Eliza to his farm in Esmeraldas, a rural municipality in Minas Gerais, hundreds of kilometers from Rio, suggesting they could work out an arrangement between them. It is impossible now to know exactly what Eliza felt as she made that journey, but the historical record suggests she still held on to a hope, however faint, that reconciliation was possible, that the father of her child might yet come around, that this trip might end differently than the pattern of the previous year had suggested it would. She arrived at the farm on June 4th, 2010, with her baby. It was the last time she was seen alive by anyone outside the small circle of people gathered on that property. According to Bruno's later account, Eliza simply left the farm of her own free will, abandoning her son with a mutual acquaintance. It was a story that asked the public to believe that a mother who had spent months fighting through courts and police stations to secure recognition and support for her child would suddenly, inexplicably, walk away from him. Few who examined the case closely found this credible, and the events that followed made the story collapse entirely. On June 26, 2010, Eliza's infant son was found abandoned in a favela in Ribeiro das Neves, alone among strangers, too young to explain how he had gotten there or where his mother had gone. Suspicion quickly fell on Diane Rodriguez do Carmo Souza, Bruno's wife, who investigators believed may have been the one to leave the child there. That same day, the civil police of Minas Gerais formally named Bruno a suspect in Eliza's disappearance. The investigation that followed moved with a mixture of urgency and horror, as pieces of the truth began emerging from unexpected places. On July 6, 2010, Bruno's 17-year-old cousin, found at the goalkeeper's residence in Barra de Tijuca, gave a statement that shocked the nation. He confessed to hitting Eliza with the butt of a gun. He said that once she was unconscious, she was transported to Minas Gerais, where, according to his account, drug traffickers dismembered her body at Bruno's request and fed portions of her remains to Rottweiler dogs kept on the property, with what remained of her bones sealed inside a layer of concrete. Investigators could not immediately confirm every detail of the teenager's account, but the broad outline was consistent with what other witnesses would describe. One of Bruno's cousins who admitted to taking part in the abduction later testified that a man involved in the crime tortured Eliza while loud music played in the background, deliberately, investigators believed, to drown out her screams. When Eliza begged for the torture to stop, saying she could not endure it any longer, she was told simply that she would not have to endure it much longer at all, because she was going to die. Days later, on July 8, 2010, a former police officer named Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, known by the nicknames Nenem, Paulista, or Bola, was arrested by the military police of Minas Gerais, accused of being the man who carried out the killing itself. Investigators came to believe that Eliza had died on or around June 10, 2010, strangled before her body was dismembered and hidden beneath concrete, remains that to this day have never been recovered. In the days that followed, arrest warrants swept outward across the group of people connected to the farm and to Bruno's inner circle. Preventive detention orders were issued for Bruno and 7 others on July 7, 2010. Bruno and his associate Luis Enrique Ferreira Romeo, known as Macareo, surrendered to police in Rio de Janeiro and were eventually transferred to Minas Gerais, where the case against them was building. By July 10, 2010, the lead investigator in the case, Edson Moreira, told reporters that the investigation was essentially complete in its conclusions, stating plainly that Eliza was dead and that the evidence, though her body had not been found, indirectly confirmed it. 9 people in total were eventually implicated in connection with the crime. There is a particular kind of grief that surrounds a case where the victim's body is never recovered. Families are denied even the finality of a burial, forced to hold 2 irreconcilable truths at once: certainty of death, provided by testimony and forensic reasoning, and the absence of physical proof that might allow mourning to fully take shape. Eliza's family lived inside that unresolved space for years, and in some ways continued to. Her father, Luis Carlos Samudio, fought publicly for custody of his grandson, and for legal recognition that Bruno was the child's father, though custody was ultimately revoked from him after deeply disturbing revelations emerged about his own past, including that he had sexually abused a child years earlier and had allowed men to abuse his daughter, Eliza herself, during her childhood in exchange for money. It was a devastating coda to an already tragic story, a reminder that Eliza's life had been marked by betrayal and exploitation long before she ever met Bruno, and that the people meant to protect her had failed her again and again, from childhood through to her final days. The trial began more than 2 years after Eliza's disappearance, opening on November 19, 2012, in the city of Contagem, Minas Gerais. Judge Marixa Fabian Lopez Rodriguez presided over a case that had already gripped the national imagination, a courtroom drama layered with football fame, betrayal, and unimaginable brutality. A jury of 6 women and 1 man was selected to weigh the evidence against Bruno, Macareo, Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, Diane Rodriguez, Fernanda Gomez de Castro, Alenilson Vida da Silva, and Wemerson Marquez de Souza, each facing different charges tied to the kidnapping, imprisonment, and killing of Eliza and to the abandonment of her infant son. The trial was not smooth. On its opening days, defense lawyers clashed repeatedly with the judge over procedural questions, with one of Marcos dos Santos's attorneys withdrawing entirely rather than continue under conditions he considered unfairly restrictive. Bruno himself attempted to dismiss his own defense team partway through, a request the judge denied, characterizing it as a tactic to delay the proceedings rather than a genuine grievance. Eventually, Bruno's portion of the trial was postponed to March of 2013, while the case against Macareo and Fernanda Gomez de Castro proceeded. When judgment finally came, it carried the weight of everything the public had followed for years. Macareo was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in Eliza's imprisonment, murder, and the concealment of her body. Fernanda Gomez de Castro received 5 years for the kidnapping and false imprisonment of both Eliza and her infant son. Marcos Aparecido dos Santos, the man accused of physically carrying out the strangulation, was sentenced to 22 years. Diane Rodriguez, Bruno's wife, was acquitted. And on March 8, 2013, Bruno himself was sentenced to 22 years and 3 months in prison for the assault, torture, and murder of Eliza Samudio. For many observers, the verdict felt like a rare instance of accountability breaking through the protective wall that fame so often builds around powerful men in Brazil. Human rights advocates later pointed to Eliza's case as a stark illustration of how deeply broken the system's early response to domestic violence complaints could be, particularly when the accused held social status and public adoration on his side. She had done everything the law asked of her. She had gone to the police. She had sought protection. She had pursued legal recognition for her son. And still, at nearly every turn before her death, the institutions meant to shield her chose caution, skepticism, or outright dismissal instead of protection. Bruno's sentence, though initially framed as 22 years, would later be reported by legal reference sources as ultimately reduced to 15 years on appeal, and he was released after serving roughly 10 years, a detail that reopened old wounds for those who had followed the case and expected the punishment to match the horror of what had been done. He would go on, controversially, to return to professional football after his release, a decision that reignited public anger and debate across Brazil about whether a convicted murderer should be allowed back into a sport still adored by millions of the same fans who had once cheered his name inside packed stadiums. Eliza was, in the truest sense, an invisible victim, a woman whose warnings went unheeded precisely because the man she accused was too visible, too celebrated, too valuable to a system that prized his fame over her safety. Eliza Samudio went to a farm in June 2010 hoping to secure a future for her son, and she never came home. Her son grew up without her, raised eventually by relatives after the collapse of his grandfather's custody claim, carrying forward the only living trace of a mother who fought, at every stage, for recognition, protection, and dignity, and who was denied all three until it was far too late. Story 4. The town of Readers sits quietly among the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, a place where church bells still mean something, and where a pastor's word carries the weight of decades of trust. It was here, in the autumn of 2010, that a single gunshot inside a small church office would unravel a secret that had been buried for more than a decade, exposing a story so disturbing that it would eventually be told across courtrooms, newspapers, and television screens throughout the country. The story belonged to a man named Arthur Burton Shermer, known to his congregations simply as A.B. He was a Methodist minister, a husband, a father, and, according to the people who thought they knew him best, a man devoted to God and family. But behind that gentle, graying face and behind the soft-spoken sermons he delivered every Sunday, there lived a very different man, one capable of unthinkable violence against the women who had loved him most. For over 3 decades, Arthur Shermer served churches across central Pennsylvania, moving from congregation to congregation as Methodist pastors often do, building a reputation as a caring and attentive spiritual leader. His first wife, Jewel Shermer, stood beside him through much of that journey. They had married young and built a family together, and to outsiders, theirs looked like the picture of a stable, God-fearing household. He was, by multiple accounts, a serial philanderer who used his position of trust to seek out vulnerable women in his own congregations, often those struggling in their marriages, and draw them into affairs. It was a quiet, corrosive betrayal that few in his church ever suspected, hidden behind the comforting mask of a man who spent his days counseling others through their darkest moments. By the late 1990s, whatever affection had once existed between Arthur and Jewel Shermer had worn thin, frayed by years of his infidelity and the strain of a marriage held together mostly by appearances. Jewel was 50 years old, a quiet presence in the Lebanon, Pennsylvania home she shared with her husband, seemingly unaware of just how far her marriage had deteriorated in secret. Neither she nor anyone around her could have imagined that April morning in 1999 would be her last. On April 23, 1999, Arthur Shermer told police a simple story. He said he had gone out for a run, leaving Jewel at home doing housework, and that when he returned, he found her lying at the bottom of the basement stairs in a pool of blood. She had, he explained, apparently lost her footing while vacuuming and tumbled down the steps, striking her head in the fall. It was a tragic accident, the kind that happens in homes everywhere, and there was little reason at the time for anyone to question it. Jewel was rushed to the hospital, but her injuries were catastrophic. She had suffered a fractured skull, along with injuries to her face, arms, legs, and body, and she never recovered. Within days, she was gone. A coroner examined the case, but could not conclusively determine whether her death was accidental or something more sinister, and ultimately, the manner of death was recorded only as undetermined. Without stronger evidence, and with no obvious motive presenting itself to local police, the investigation stalled and the file was closed. Arthur Shermer buried his wife, accepted condolences from his grieving congregation, and quietly returned to his pastoral duties. If there had been screams that morning, if there had been a struggle in that basement, no one outside those walls would know for years. Life moved on. Shermer eventually remarried. His new wife was a woman named Betty Jean Shermer, and together they settled into a home in the small community of Readers, nestled in the wooded hills of the Pocono Mountains. To his church family, it looked like new love had bloomed out of loss, a widowed pastor finding companionship again after tragedy. But the pattern that had defined his first marriage had not disappeared. It had simply found a new target. Betty Jean Shermer was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a warm and trusting woman who believed deeply in the vows she had made. As the years passed, however, she began to suspect that her husband's devotion was not as complete as he professed. Betty had discovered evidence of an affair Arthur was having, this time with his own secretary, a woman he worked alongside every day at the church. Confronted with the truth, Betty did what any wounded, self-respecting spouse might do. She gave her husband a choice: end the affair, or their marriage would end instead. It was the kind of ultimatum that, in a healthier relationship, might have led to counseling, to painful conversations, perhaps even to a difficult but survivable separation. For Arthur Shermer, it became something far more dangerous. Betty's insistence on the truth, her refusal to simply look away as perhaps Jewel once had, put everything at risk for him. his reputation, his standing in the church, his comfortable life. And on the night of July 25th, 2008, that risk came to a violent, irreversible end. Shermer told police that he and Betty had been driving home together that night when a deer suddenly darted into the road. He said he swerved to avoid the animal, lost control of the vehicle, and crashed. In the chaos of the impact, he claimed, Betty's head had struck the windshield, causing the injuries that would ultimately prove fatal. It was a story tragically familiar to anyone who has driven through the wooded roads of the Poconos at night, where deer crossings are a genuine and constant hazard. There was no reason on its surface for police in Monroe County to disbelieve a grieving husband's account of an accident. Betty never woke up. She died in the hospital the following day, and at Arthur's request, her body was cremated shortly afterward, a decision that would later strike investigators as curious, given that cremation eliminates the possibility of any future forensic re-examination of the body. At the time, though, there was no active suspicion, and Shermer was left to grieve, once again, the sudden and violent loss of a wife. He returned to his church and, remarkably, to the very secretary with whom Betty had confronted him. Just weeks after burying Betty, Shermer was in a hotel room with another woman entirely, a retired educator named Dawn Bear, continuing the same pattern of secrecy and betrayal that had defined his life for years. For 2 years, the story of Betty's death sat quietly in the record books as an unfortunate accident on a dark Pennsylvania road, a tragedy attributed to nothing more than bad luck and a startled animal. It was not detective work, at least not at first, that reopened the case. It was a devastating act of grief and rage by an unrelated third party. In 2010, a man named Joseph Mezant walked into the office of Shermer's church in a state of complete emotional collapse. Mezant had discovered that his own wife was having an affair, and the man she had been involved with was Arthur Shermer. Overwhelmed by the betrayal and heartbreak, Mezant took his own life inside that office, a horrifying and irreversible act that shattered the quiet facade Shermer had maintained for so long. The suicide sent shockwaves through the small community and, more importantly, drew the attention of investigators directly to Arthur Shermer's personal conduct in a way that nothing had before. As police began digging into the pastor's private life, uncomfortable details started to surface, first about his habitual infidelity, and then about the sudden, violent death of his wife Betty just 2 years earlier. What had once seemed like an unremarkable car accident began to look, under closer inspection, deeply suspicious. Authorities in Monroe County reopened the investigation into Betty's death, and this time, they brought in medical experts to re-examine everything that remained of the case, since Betty's body itself had already been cremated. Forensic pathologist Dr. Wayne Ross reviewed the available evidence and reached a chilling conclusion. The injuries described did not match the kind of trauma typically seen in a low-speed car accident. Instead, they were consistent with someone having been struck repeatedly with a heavy, cylindrical object, something like a crowbar. Investigators came to believe that Shermer had beaten Betty, loaded her unconscious or dying body into their car, and then deliberately staged a crash to explain her injuries and hide what he had actually done. As investigators dug deeper into Shermer's past, they inevitably arrived back at the death of his first wife, Jewel, more than a decade earlier. The parallels were impossible to ignore. 2 wives, 2 supposed accidents, 2 sets of catastrophic head injuries, and one common denominator standing at the center of both tragedies. Detectives requested that Jewel's case be reopened as well, and prosecutors turned once again to Dr. Ross, who had also performed the original autopsy on Jewel back in 1999. Ross's renewed examination of Jewel's case was damning. He testified that her injuries, like Betty's, were far more consistent with a violent beating than with an accidental fall down a flight of stairs. Investigators went so far as to use a crash test dummy to recreate the physics of a fall down that basement staircase, testing whether it was possible for someone to sustain the specific pattern and severity of injuries Jewel had suffered simply by tumbling down the steps. The results were striking. The crash dummy, evidence suggested it was extremely unlikely that a simple fall could account for everything doctors had documented on Jewel's body. A grand jury reviewing the findings wrote that they found it particularly disturbing and difficult to believe that both of Schirmer's wives could have suffered such horrific injuries by pure accident, concluding instead that neither woman had likely died naturally or accidentally at all. Arthur Schirmer was charged in September 2010 with the murder of Betty Schirmer. 2 years later, in the autumn of 2012, a Lebanon County grand jury formally recommended charges in the death of his first wife, Jewel, as well. The pastor who had once stood at pulpits offering comfort to grieving families now found himself facing accusations that he had created that grief himself, twice over, for his own convenience. Schirmer's defense team fought back hard against the accusations. His attorney argued that prosecutors were relying on flawed forensic science and on nothing more than gossip about his client's extramarital affairs to manufacture a case where none truly existed. Schirmer's 3 adult children, born to him and Jewel, publicly stood behind their father, releasing a statement expressing that they were deeply saddened and disappointed by what they called false accusations, insisting he was innocent of everything he had been charged with. It was a painful reminder that behind every headline in a case like this, there were real families forced to grapple with unbearable questions about someone they loved. The trial for Betty's murder began in January 2013 in Monroe County. Jurors sat through harrowing testimony, including detailed accounts from Dr. Ross about the nature of both women's injuries and crime scene photographs that left little room for comfortable distance from the violence involved. Prosecutors built their case around the theory that Schirmer had struck Betty with a heavy object, likely a crowbar, then staged the appearance of a car accident to cover his tracks, motivated by his desire to keep his secret affair concealed and his life uninterrupted by divorce. Witnesses, including one of the women with whom Schirmer had carried on an affair, offered testimony that painted a picture of a man skilled at deception, someone who could carry on a secret relationship with the same calm confidence with which he delivered a Sunday sermon. On January 17, 2013, the jury reached its verdict. Arthur Schirmer was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Betty Jean Schirmer. 2 months later, in March 2013, he stood before a judge in Monroe County Court and received the only sentence Pennsylvania law allows for such a conviction: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once stood before congregations promising hope and redemption now stood condemned to spend the remainder of his life behind bars, having taken the very thing he had vowed before God to protect. Even with a life sentence secured, the story was not finished. Schirmer still faced trial for the death of his first wife, Jewel, a case that had waited more than a decade for its day in court. That trial unfolded in Lebanon County, where prosecutors again called on forensic testimony to argue that Jewel's death mirrored Betty's far too closely to be coincidence, and that both women had been killed by the same hands, using the same brutal method, separated by 9 years, but united by the same underlying motive of a husband unwilling to let go of control over his life and reputation. In December 2015, Schirmer was convicted in connection with Jewel's death and was sentenced to an additional 20 to 40 years in prison. Though the sentence was for a lesser charge than the first-degree murder conviction he had already received for Betty's death, it closed the final chapter on a case that had spanned more than 16 years from Jewel's fall down those basement stairs to the final gavel in the Lebanon County courtroom. Arthur Schirmer, once a trusted spiritual leader to congregations across Pennsylvania, would now spend the rest of his natural life in prison, having been convicted of killing not one, but both of the women who had shared his life and his home. What lingers most about the Arthur Schirmer case is not simply the violence itself, but the years of quiet suffering that preceded it and followed in its wake. Jewel Schirmer spent decades believing in a marriage that was, in reality, hollowed out by betrayal she likely never fully understood. Betty Jean Schirmer discovered the truth about her husband's infidelity, only to have that discovery become, prosecutors argued, the very reason her life was cut short. And an innocent third party, Joseph Maisant, was so devastated by the ripple effects of Schirmer's deceit that he took his own life. An act of despair that ultimately became the catalyst for uncovering the truth about two murders that might otherwise have remained forever filed away as tragic accidents. There is a horror in a case like this, one that has little to do with sudden violence in a dark alley or the actions of a stranger, and everything to do with the quiet, patient betrayal of trust by someone whose entire public identity was built on offering comfort and guidance to others. Arthur Schirmer stood in front of grieving families for decades, offering words of solace about loss, about faith, about the presence of God even in life's darkest moments, all while carrying, in his own past, the truth of what he had done to the women who trusted him most completely. The people of Readers, and of every congregation Schirmer had once served, were left to reconcile the gentle pastor they thought they knew with the man the evidence ultimately revealed him to be, a reckoning that, for many, may never feel fully complete. Story 5. In the autumn of 1999, as the final year of the millennium drew to a close, the small city of Flint, Michigan, was struggling through difficult economic times. Once a thriving automotive hub, the region had been devastated by factory closures and population decline. But for some, opportunity could still be found in the ruins of industry. Bruce Miller, a 47-year-old businessman, had carved out a successful life for himself by running B&D Auto, a salvage yard in the nearby community of M.T. Morris where he bought, sold, and dismantled vehicles for parts. Bruce was a man who understood the value of hard work and persistence. His salvage yard was more than just a business. It was a testament to his ability to build something substantial from society's discarded machinery. He would arrive at the yard each morning, often before dawn, ready to negotiate deals with suppliers and customers. Those who knew him described a man who was friendly but shrewd, someone who knew the automotive business inside and out. He typically carried around $2,000 in cash in his shirt pocket, money he used to make quick deals for car parts and scrap metal. In his line of work, cash was king, and Bruce understood that better than most. In his personal life, Bruce had recently remarried. His new wife was Sherry Paulette Kitley, a woman 17 years his junior, who had been born on October 13, 1971. Sherry was attractive, outgoing, and charming, with a personality that drew people to her. She had 2 children from previous relationships, and Bruce had embraced his role as a stepfather. From the outside, they appeared to be building a life together, blending their families and pursuing the American dream. They had plans for the future, discussions about the business, conversations about growing old together. But beneath the surface of their marriage, secrets were festering that would ultimately destroy everything. Just a few months into their marriage, Sherry had begun spending considerable time online, chatting with men in America online chat rooms. This was the late 1990s, when the internet was still relatively new to most American households, and the anonymity it provided created a space where people could reinvent themselves, create fictional personas, and engage in relationships that existed purely in the digital realm. For Sherry, these online interactions became something of an addiction. She would later describe it as a game, comparing her relationships with multiple men to levels in a video game. Each man represented a new challenge, each relationship another test of how much she could manipulate someone, how much she could make them believe. Sherry used screen names that left little to the imagination about her intentions. She went by just Hot to See You, many other vulgar names. Through these personas, she chatted with numerous men, sending provocative messages and photos, building relationships that were intensely intimate despite being conducted entirely through typed words and digital images. 800 miles away in Reno, Nevada, a man named Jerry Cassidy was navigating his own personal crisis. Born in 1957, Cassidy had once been a rising star in law enforcement. He had worked his way up to lieutenant in the Kansas City Police Force, heading the Homicide Division and building a reputation as a competent investigator with a promising future. But life has a way of derailing even the most carefully laid plans. Cassidy suffered an injury at work, and in the aftermath, he he became dependent on prescription painkillers. As his addiction deepened, his career crumbled. He clashed with a powerful sheriff and eventually lost his job, watching helplessly as everything he had built disintegrated. His marriage collapsed under the weight of his problems, and Cassidy relocated to Reno to start over. He found work at a casino, a far cry from the prestigious position he had once held. Those who knew him during this period described a man who was deeply wounded, struggling with financial problems, addiction issues, and profound loneliness. He was, in the words of one co-worker, ripe for the picking, vulnerable to anyone who might offer him hope or affection in his darkest hour. It was in this state that Jerry Cassidy logged into an AOL chatroom sometime in early 1999 and encountered Sherry Miller. What began as casual conversation quickly escalated into something far more intense. Sherry sent him nude photographs and increasingly explicit messages. Their instant message exchanges became a daily occurrence, sometimes lasting for hours. For Cassidy, who was isolated and desperate for connection, Sherry became an obsession. He would sign off his messages with phrases like, "You're fool for life, Big Daddy," completely unaware of how prophetic those words would prove to be. Their relationship progressed from the virtual world to physical reality when Sherry traveled to Reno under the pretense of a business trip for Mary Kay Cosmetics, the company for which she worked as a sales representative. When she met Cassidy in person, she threw herself into the role of devoted lover. They went house shopping together, talking about a future they would build as a couple. She spoke of leaving Bruce and starting fresh with Cassidy, painting pictures of the life they would share. For Cassidy, who had lost so much, Sherry represented redemption, a second chance at happiness. But Sherry was spinning an elaborate web of lies, and she was remarkably skilled at it. She told Cassidy that Bruce was not just her husband, but a violent, abusive monster who beat her regularly. She claimed that Bruce was involved in organized crime and that her life was in constant danger. Most devastatingly, she told Cassidy on 2 separate occasions that she was pregnant with his child. Each time, she would later claim that Bruce had beaten her so severely that she lost the baby. The miscarriages, she said, were Bruce's fault. He had murdered their unborn children through his brutality. For Cassidy, a former police officer trained to protect the innocent, these revelations triggered something primal. Here was a woman he loved, carrying his children, being victimized by a violent criminal. The thought of his babies dying because of Bruce Miller's abuse filled him with rage. And Sherry, recognizing the power she held over him, carefully stoked that rage. Through their instant messages and emails, she began suggesting that the only way they could be together was if Bruce was eliminated. She spoke of taking justice into their own hands, of going down the vigilante route. As a former homicide investigator, Cassidy had the knowledge and skills to carry out such a plan, and Sherry knew it. By November 1999, the plan was fully formed. Cassidy would travel from Reno to Michigan and kill Bruce Miller at his salvage yard. Sherry provided detailed instructions, including directions to B&D Auto and specific guidance about how to execute the murder. Her messages were chillingly direct. Just do it and get the hell out of there. On November 7, 1999, before leaving for Michigan, Jerry Cassidy told his brother Mike that he was going out of town. In what would prove to be a prophetic statement, he said that if he did not return within a couple of days, Mike should look under his bed for a briefcase. It was an odd instruction, one that Mike would not fully understand until months later. The following evening, November 8, 1999, Bruce Miller was working late at B&D Auto. The salvage yard was quiet, the sun had already set, and most of the day's business had concluded. When Jerry Cassidy arrived, Bruce likely assumed he was just another customer, perhaps someone looking for a specific part or wanting to sell some scrap metal. Bruce would have approached him openly, ready to negotiate a deal. What happened next occurred with brutal efficiency. Cassidy raised a 20-gauge shotgun and fired, striking Bruce in the neck and upper back. Bruce Miller collapsed in the office of his own business, dying among the machinery and metal that had been his livelihood. Cassidy then took Bruce's wallet and the cash from his pocket, staging the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. Then he climbed back into his vehicle and began the 800-mile drive back to Reno. When Cassidy reached a safe location, he called Sherry's landline and let it ring once before hanging up. This was the prearranged signal they had agreed upon, his way of telling her that the deed was done, that her husband was dead, and that he was on his way back to Nevada. When Bruce's body was discovered, the Genesee County Sheriff's Department launched a murder investigation. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly what Cassidy had intended it to look like, an armed robbery that had turned deadly. Bruce was known to carry large amounts of cash, and the missing money and wallet supported this theory. But detectives also had another promising lead almost immediately. When they interviewed Sherry, she was calm and composed, playing the role of grieving widow convincingly. But she also had a suspect to suggest, John Hutchinson. Sherry explained that Hutchinson was a former employee of Bruce's who had borrowed $2,000 and had been slow to repay it. More significantly, both Hutchinson and Bruce had been under investigation by the Genesee County Auto Investigation Network for tampering with vehicle identification numbers on cars. Sherry hinted that there was bad blood between the two men, that Bruce might have been planning to cooperate with police and implicate Hutchinson, giving him a powerful motive for murder. The evidence against Hutchinson seemed substantial. His brother Harold, who also worked at B&D Auto, told police that John had threatened to dispose of Bruce Miller because of both the criminal investigation and the loan dispute. Even more damningly, Harold testified that on the evening of the murder, around 7 o'clock, John Hutchinson had called him and said he had disposed of Bruce Miller. Harold understood his brother to mean that John had killed Bruce. The next morning, before news of the murder had even broken, John Hutchinson's stepson Anthony Birch told police that John had been acting strangely the night before, disappearing from home between 5:30 and 7:30. When Hutchinson was administered a polygraph test, he failed, showing deceptive responses when denying involvement in the murder. Detectives believed they had their man. The case appeared to be heading toward a resolution. Sherry, meanwhile, had a solid alibi for the time of the murder. She was nowhere near the salvage yard when Bruce was killed. She appeared to be the innocent widow of a businessman who had been murdered by a disgruntled associate. But then, 3 months after Bruce Miller's death, everything changed in the most unexpected way. On February 11, 2000, Jerry Cassidy sat alone in his bedroom in Reno with a gun in his hand. The weeks since the murder had not brought him the happiness he had expected. Sherry had dropped him immediately after Bruce's death. She had moved on to a new boyfriend and was making no effort to continue their relationship. The woman for whom he had committed murder, the woman he had called the love of his life, had discarded him as soon as he had served his purpose. In his final moments, Cassidy must have realized the full extent of how he had been manipulated, how completely he had been used. He wrote 4 suicide notes. 3 were to his loved ones, his youngest son, his ex-wife, and his parents. The 4th was taped to a briefcase with instructions that it should be given to an attorney. Then Jerry Cassidy, former police lieutenant and homicide investigator, put the gun to his head and pulled the trigger. When his brother Mike came to clean out Cassidy's belongings, he found the briefcase and followed the instructions. Inside was what one prosecutor would later describe as a treasure trove of information. Cassidy had methodically documented everything. There were printouts of AOL instant messages between him and Sherry from November 7th and November 8th, detailing their plot to kill Bruce Miller. There was a computer hard drive containing months of email communications revealing the extent of their relationship, Sherry's false claims about pregnancies and abuse, and explicit discussions about murdering her husband. There were directions to B&D Auto and specific instructions from Sherry about how to carry out the killing. The suicide note addressed to his parents explained everything, detailing why he had done what he did. As a former investigator, Cassidy knew exactly what evidence was needed to secure a conviction, and he had assembled it all meticulously. The Missouri attorney who received the briefcase contacted Michigan authorities. When Genesee County detectives saw the contents, they realized immediately that they had been investigating the wrong suspect. John Hutchinson had not killed Bruce Miller. The murderer was a man who had already punished himself with the ultimate penalty, and the mastermind behind it all was the grieving widow they had believed to be a victim. In February 2000, Sherry Miller was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. When detectives played the audio recordings of her interrogation, her hubris was evident. She initially denied everything, claiming she barely knew Cassidy. But as investigators presented piece after piece of evidence, her story began to crumble. She admitted to a relationship, but claimed Cassidy was obsessed with her. She suggested the instant messages had been hacked and altered, that the incriminating statements were fabrications. Throughout it all, she maintained that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. The trial of Sherry Miller began on December 12, 2000, and it captured national attention as the first internet murder case, and Americans across the country became riveted by this story of digital deception and deadly manipulation. For prosecutor Marcy Mabry, the case presented unique challenges. The technology involved was unfamiliar to many people in the courtroom, including the jurors. With the confessed gunman dead, the case was entirely circumstantial, dependent on proving that the emails and instant messages were genuine, and that Sherry had used them to manipulate Cassidy into committing murder. The prosecution brought in representatives from America Online to authenticate the digital evidence. They presented months of daily emails that had to be cross-referenced and fact-checked. They established a motive. Sherry stood to receive Social Security benefits and life insurance payouts upon Bruce's death, far more than she would have received in a divorce. And they painted a portrait of a woman who treated relationships like a game, who manipulated vulnerable men for her own amusement and ultimately for her own financial gain. Against her attorney's advice, Sherry Miller took the stand in her own defense. She maintained her innocence, stuck to her story that the evidence had been manipulated, and attempted to portray herself as a victim of Cassidy's obsession. But then came a pivotal moment that would seal her fate. When asked if all the exhibits presented by the prosecution were true, she answered yes. Jury foreman Michael Thorpe would later reflect on that moment, suggesting it revealed her hubris. She thought she could make anyone believe her, that she could sell the jury on her innocence through sheer force of personality. Instead, she had essentially admitted to the authenticity of the very evidence that condemned her. On December 22, 2000, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges. On January 29, 2001, Judge Judith Fullerton sentenced Sherry Miller to life in prison for conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and 54 to 81 years for second-degree murder. She was taken away to begin serving her sentence at the Robert Scott Correctional Facility, and later transferred to the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. But the legal battle was far from over. In 2008, a federal court judge overturned her conviction, ruling that Cassidy's suicide note should not have been admitted as evidence because he was dead and could not be cross-examined. For a brief period in 2009, Sherry Miller was released on bond, pending a new trial. During this time, she joined Facebook, claiming she needed it to stay in touch with her son, who was serving in the military overseas. The irony was not lost on prosecutors, who noted that this was exactly why people need to be careful about who they communicate with online. The legal proceedings continued for years, bouncing between various courts. In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court vacated previous rulings and remanded the case. Finally, in 2012, a district court ordered the reinstatement of Miller's convictions, finding that the suicide note possessed sufficient guarantees of trustworthiness to satisfy constitutional requirements. The United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit affirmed this decision in 2014, and Sherry Miller's brief taste of freedom came to an end. She was returned to prison to serve out her life sentence. In 2016, after maintaining her innocence for 16 years, Sherry Miller sent a 4-page typed letter to Judge Fullerton admitting her role in her husband's death. Today, Sherry Miller remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Her mother has custody of one of her 3 children. For the family of Bruce Miller, no amount of justice can restore what was taken from them. A man who had worked hard to build a successful business, who had tried to build a life with a woman he loved, was murdered in the prime of his life because that woman saw him as an obstacle to financial gain and an opportunity for psychological games. For Jerry Cassaday's family, the tragedy is equally profound. A man who had fallen on hard times became a pawn in a deadly game, manipulated into committing murder by lies about abuse and dead children that never existed. His final act was to ensure his manipulator would face justice, even though he would not live to see it. Story 6. The morning of November 26, 2010, dawned cold and gray over the small town of Morenci, Michigan, a rural community nestled against the Ohio border, where everyone knew everyone else's business and children played safely in quiet streets. Tanya Zuvers checked her phone for what must have been the 10th time that hour, waiting for word from her ex-husband about when she could pick up their 3 sons. Andrew, 9 years old, Alexander, 7, and Tanner, just 5, had spent Thanksgiving Day with their father, John Skelton, and Tanya was anxious to have them back home. The holiday had been part of their custody arrangement, worked out amid a bitter divorce that had turned increasingly contentious over the past few months. But John Skelton was not answering his phone. Hours passed with no word, no text, no explanation for the delay. As morning stretched into afternoon, Tanya's anxiety transformed into alarm. She began calling hospitals, checking with friends and family, desperate for any information about her boys. Finally, she learned that John was in a local hospital being treated for a broken ankle. When she rushed to find him, hoping the boys were safe in a waiting room or with a nurse, she discovered something far more disturbing. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner were nowhere to be found. John Skelton lay in a hospital bed, his ankle in a cast, and told hospital staff and later police a story that made no sense to anyone who heard it. He claimed he had attempted suicide by hanging himself from the second-floor banister of his home. The rope had broken, he said, and the fall had shattered his ankle. When asked about his sons, his answers were vague, shifting, impossible to verify. First, he told Tanya the boys were with a friend and would be back soon. Then he claimed he did not know where they were, because he was not sure who had them. As investigators pressed him for details, his story morphed into something even more bizarre. He had given his sons to an underground organization to protect them from their mother, whom he claimed was dangerous. Tanya Zuvers stood in that hospital, facing the man she had once loved and with whom she had built a family, and felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her sons were missing. Their father, the last person to see them alive, was telling absurd stories that made no sense while lying in a hospital bed after a reported suicide attempt. And with each passing hour, the likelihood of finding her boys safe and healthy diminished. The story of how this nightmare came to be begins months earlier, in a marriage that had deteriorated beyond repair. Tanya and John Skelton had 3 beautiful boys together, each with their own personality and quirks. Andrew was the oldest at 9, responsible and protective of his younger brothers. Alexander, 7, was the middle child, always trying to keep peace and make everyone happy. Tanner, the baby of the family at 5 years old, was still discovering the world with wide eyes and endless questions. For years, they had been a family, but by 2010, the marriage was crumbling under the weight of dysfunction and mutual distrust. In September 2010, just 2 months before the boys would disappear, John Skelton did something that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. He took Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner out of school without Tanya's knowledge or permission and drove them to Florida, where his parents lived. It was, by any legal definition, parental kidnapping. Tanya was frantic, filing police reports and working with authorities across state lines to locate her children. A judge in Florida eventually intervened, ordering that Tanya and John jointly bring the boys back to Michigan, where a custody order giving Tanya full custody would take effect once they crossed the state line. The Florida incident should have been a wake-up call to everyone involved about John Skelton's instability and his willingness to violate court orders when it came to his sons. But the legal system moves slowly, and custody disputes are messy, complicated affairs where the lines between parental rights and children's safety can become dangerously blurred. In the wake of the Florida kidnapping, John was given supervised visitation rights. The Thanksgiving visit in November 2010 was supposed to be one such visit, a court-ordered opportunity for a father to spend time with his sons under the watchful eye of the legal system. It would be the last time anyone would see Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton alive. On Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 2010, neighbors in Morenci reported seeing the three Skelton brothers playing in the yard of their father's home. Andrew, with his 9-year-old sense of responsibility, likely kept an eye on his younger brothers as they played. Alexander and Tanner probably ran and laughed and enjoyed the crisp autumn day. It was an ordinary scene of childhood, 3 boys making memories with their father on a holiday. No one who saw them that day could have imagined it would be the last confirmed sighting of the children. What happened in the hours after that sighting remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Michigan's history. John Skelton has never provided a consistent, verifiable account of what he did with his sons. What investigators do know, pieced together through phone records and forensic evidence, paints a chilling picture of a man executing a plan in the early morning hours while his children's fate hung in the balance. Cell phone tower data tracked John Skelton's phone leaving Morenci at approximately 4:30 a.m. on November 26th, traveling 20 to 25 miles southwest into Ohio. The phone was turned off, remained silent for over 2 hours, and then reappeared back in Morenci shortly after 6 a.m. What happened during those 2 hours and 15 minutes? Where did John Skelton go in Ohio? And most importantly, what did he do with Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner? John Skelton has offered multiple explanations, each more fantastical than the last. In one version, he gave the boys to a woman named Joan Taylor, though investigators could never find any evidence such a woman existed. In another telling, he handed his sons over to an underground organization that helps protect children from abusive parents. He claimed these people would keep the boys safe from Tanya, spinning a narrative in which he was the protective hero and she was the villain. Investigators checked every lead, followed every thread, and found nothing to substantiate any of his claims. At one point during his incarceration, John Skelton provided another story, telling authorities that a man who helps people leave Amish communities might have information about the boys. Investigators pursued this lead as well, only to determine it was, in the words of one detective, another lie. Throughout his imprisonment, John Skelton has told investigators he had a vision of the boys being put in a dumpster in an area in Ohio, a statement so disturbing and specific that it suggested either a confession disguised as a vision or a deliberate attempt to manipulate investigators and prolong the agony of everyone searching for answers. The immediate aftermath of the boys' disappearance triggered one of the most extensive searches in Michigan history. Law enforcement officers, volunteers, and desperate family members scoured the woods and waterways of both Michigan and Ohio. They searched abandoned buildings, checked dumpsters, dragged ponds, and followed up on hundreds of tips from the public. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, but no trace of Andrew, Alexander, or Tanner Skelton was ever found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence whatsoever of what had happened to 3 young boys who had simply vanished. In December 2010, while still hospitalized and under psychiatric observation following his reported suicide attempt, John Skelton was arrested and charged with 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. It was not the murder charge that investigators wanted to bring. They had no bodies, no crime scene, and no physical evidence of homicide. But they had phone records that proved John Skelton had lied about the boys' whereabouts. They had his shifting stories that contradicted one another, and they had the undeniable fact that 3 children were missing, and their father was the last person to see them alive. In September 2011, John Skelton pleaded guilty to the unlawful imprisonment charges. He was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison, the maximum sentence for the crime. Judge Lori Mancha, presiding over the case, made clear her belief that John Skelton knew exactly what had happened to his sons, and that his refusal to provide truthful information was an ongoing source of torment for their mother and everyone who loved the boys. But without bodies or evidence of murder, the court's hands were tied. John Skelton would serve his time for unlawful imprisonment, and the question of what really happened to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner would remain unanswered. For Tanya Zuvers, the mother who had been waiting to pick up her sons on that cold November morning in 2010, the past 15 years have been an unimaginable hell. She has lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to properly mourn her children because they have never been found, unable to move forward because the man responsible for their disappearance has never told the truth. In March 2025, as John Skelton's release date approached, Tanya made a difficult but necessary decision. She filed a petition with Lenawee County Probate Court asking that her 3 sons be declared legally dead. It was not a declaration she wanted to make. What mother wants to stand in court and ask a judge to declare her children deceased? But after 15 years with no contact, no sightings, and no evidence that the boys were alive, Tanya needed closure. She needed the legal recognition that her sons were gone so she could settle financial matters, resolve legal issues, and perhaps most importantly, give Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner the respect and acknowledgement that their lives had meaning. The probate hearing in March 2025 was extraordinarily emotional. Tanya testified about her relationship with John Skelton, the deterioration of their marriage, the Florida kidnapping incident, and the horrifying moment when she realized her sons were missing. She described each of her boys, their personalities, their quirks, the things that made them unique and special. She told the court about Andrew's sense of responsibility, about Alexander's peacemaking nature, about Tanner's curiosity and joy. And then she said the words that every person in that courtroom felt in their bones. "There is no doubt in my mind that John killed them." Law enforcement officers also testified at the hearing, detailing the exhaustive search efforts, the investigation into John Skelton's movements on November 26th, and the numerous false leads he had provided over the years. They described the far-fetched, unfathomable yarns John had spun, leading investigators on one wild goose chase after another. Every detective who worked the case testified that in their professional opinion, based on all the evidence they had gathered over 15 years, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton were deceased, and their father was responsible. Judge Catherine Sala listened to all the testimony, reviewed the evidence, and acknowledged the overwhelming circumstantial case that John Skelton had killed his sons. But in a moment that must have felt like salt in an open wound for Tanya and her family, Judge Sala ruled that while she could declare the boys legally dead based on their 15-year absence, she could not make a legal finding that John Skelton had murdered them. The evidence was speculative and circumstantial, based largely on investigators' opinions and hearsay. Without bodies, without a crime scene, without physical evidence of homicide, the legal conclusion of murder could not be reached. On March 3, 2025, Judge Sala granted Tanya's petition and declared Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton legally deceased as of November 26, 2010, the last day they were seen alive. The ruling gave Tanya the legal recognition she had sought, but it could not give her what she really wanted: justice for her sons and the truth about what happened to them. As the March hearing concluded, everyone in that courtroom knew that time was running out. John Skelton's 15-year maximum sentence was approaching its end. According to Michigan Department of Corrections records, he was scheduled to be released from Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, on November 29, 2025, 15 years and 4 days after his sons disappeared. He had been denied parole multiple times over the years, but with his sentence maxing out, the state had no legal authority to keep him imprisoned unless new charges were filed. The prospect of John Skelton walking free has reopened all the wounds for Tanya Zuvers and for the Morenci community that has never forgotten the 3 boys who vanished on Thanksgiving. Law enforcement has made clear that the investigation remains open, and that they would charge John with murder if they could develop sufficient evidence. But after 15 years of searching, after dragging rivers and scouring forests, after following every lead and chasing down every one of John's lies, they remained no closer to finding Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner's bodies or gathering the physical evidence needed for a murder prosecution. Tanya Zuvers has said that she prays someone will cure her broken heart, though she knows that only the truth about what happened to her sons can do that. She has lived for 15 years in a limbo where she cannot properly grieve, cannot find peace, and cannot escape the knowledge that the man who took her children from her will soon walk free while Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner remain lost. The case of the Skelton brothers stands as one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. 3 young boys, full of life and promise, spent Thanksgiving with their father and simply vanished into thin air. Their bodies have never been found. The truth about what happened to them has never been told. And the man at the center of it all, the father who took them and never brought them back, has maintained his web of lies for 15 years while their mother has endured a living nightmare. As John Skelton prepares for release on November 29, 2025, he will walk out of Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility a free man. He will return to a world that has changed dramatically in the 15 years he has been imprisoned. But the 3 boys he left behind on that Thanksgiving in 2010 will remain frozen in time. Andrew at 9 years old, Alexander at 7, and Tanner at 5. They will remain missing, their fate unknown, their final resting place a secret that only their father knows. The people of Morenci, Michigan, still remember the day the Skelton brothers disappeared. They remember the massive search efforts, the heartbreak on Tanya's face, the realization that something unspeakable had happened in their quiet community. They remember 3 little boys playing in a yard on Thanksgiving Day, and they remember that those boys never came home. As John Skelton walks free, the community and the world will continue to ask the questions that have haunted this case for 15 years. What did you do with your sons, John? Where are Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner? And will you ever tell the truth? The Skelton brothers' case reminds us that sometimes the most profound tragedies are the ones without resolution, the questions without answers, the grief without closure. Tanya Zuvers has said that even without her sons' bodies, their lives still meant something. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton mattered. They were loved. They are remembered. And somewhere, perhaps known only to the father who failed them so catastrophically, 3 brothers rest together, their story unfinished, their potential unfulfilled, their absence a wound that will never fully heal. Story 7. The air in Itzehoe, a quiet town in the north of Germany, carried the familiar scent of the nearby Store River and the distant, subtle hum of industry. For Lars Joachim Mittank, born February 9, 1986, this was the entire world. It was the place where he had grown up, made friends, found work at the local power plant, and built a life that was, by all accounts, perfectly ordinary. At 28, Lars was a steady, reliable presence. He was the kind of man who visited his parents frequently, who stepped up without hesitation to help around their home after his father suffered a stroke. He was, as those who knew him best would later describe, simply a normal person, grounded in the routines and relationships that made up his quiet corner of Schleswig-Holstein. In the late spring of 2014, however, a ripple of excitement disturbed the placid surface of his life. His friends were planning a trip, a week-long escape from the familiar to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. They were headed to Golden Sands, Bulgaria, a resort town whose name promised golden beaches and hedonistic fun. For Lars, who had never before traveled outside of Germany, it was an adventure, a brief departure from the predictable rhythm of his life. He agreed to go, joining 5 of his friends for what was supposed to be a carefree holiday. On June 30th, 2014, the group arrived in Varna, Bulgaria. The contrast with Itzehoe was immediate and intoxicating. Golden Sands was a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of hotels, clubs, and sunseekers, all pressed against the sparkling coastline. One of Lars's friends, Paul Roman, would later recall the week with a wistful simplicity. "We relaxed on the beach, swam in the pool, played football, went clubbing," he said. Lars, he remembered, was relaxed and in a good mood, swept up in the easy joy of the vacation. Yet, even in paradise, a subtle discordance began to emerge. Another friend, Tim Schult, noticed something slightly off about Lars's eating habits. While the others indulged in the all-inclusive offerings, Lars seemed to subsist on small bowls of soup or modest salads, his appetite curiously restrained. It was a minor detail, a footnote in a week of otherwise untroubled leisure, but in the harrowing retrospective that was to come, every small anomaly would be scrutinized, magnified, and questioned. The first 6 days passed in a blur of sun, sand, and nightlife. The trip was drawing to a close, with their return flight scheduled for the morning of July 7th. On the evening of July 6th, their last night in Golden Sands, the friends went out to a local bar. The atmosphere was boisterous, fueled by cheap beer and the kind of transient camaraderie that blossoms in holiday resorts. It was here that the first definitive crack appeared in the idyllic facade of their trip. The conversation turned to football, a subject that often ignites passionate debate among German men. Lars was a devoted fan of SV Werder Bremen, a club from northern Germany. The men he was talking to, however, were supporters of the Bavarian powerhouse, FC Bayern Munich. What began as a typical sports rivalry, a clash of club loyalties, escalated into a heated disagreement. The exact details of the argument remain murky, lost to the noise of the bar and the haze of memory, but it was tense enough that Lars eventually parted ways with his friends outside a restaurant, walking off into the Bulgarian night alone. His friends didn't see him again until the next morning. When Lars finally reappeared at the resort, something was terribly wrong. He told his friends a confusing, alarming story. He had been beaten up. But the narrative was fractured. Some friends recalled him saying he was attacked by the same Bayern Munich fans he had argued with in the bar. Others remembered a more sinister version, in which the men from the bar had hired a group of 4 locals to ambush and assault him. Whatever the true sequence of events, the physical evidence was undeniable. Lars had a painful injury to his jaw and, more critically, a ruptured eardrum. The idyllic holiday had ended in violence. His friends, alarmed, immediately rallied around him. They accompanied him to a local doctor, who confirmed the injuries. The diagnosis was clear and had immediate, life-altering consequences. Flying was out of the question. The change in cabin pressure could cause serious, permanent damage to his perforated eardrum. The doctor prescribed cefprozil, a 500 milligrams antibiotic to prevent infection, and strongly advised him to delay his flight. His friends offered to stay. They wouldn't leave him alone in a foreign country, injured and shaken. But Lars was insistent. He told them he was fine, that he could manage on his own. He urged them to stick to their original plan and fly home as scheduled. Reluctantly, they agreed. On July 7th, they checked out of the resort and headed to Varna Airport, leaving their friend behind to navigate the fallout of a holiday gone wrong. Lars checked out at the same time as his friends, but instead of heading home, he looked for new, temporary lodging. He found the Hotel Color Varna, a cheap and conveniently located establishment near the airport. He checked in for a single night, intending to rest and reschedule his flight home as soon as the doctor deemed it safe. But alone in the anonymous hotel room, separated from the familiar comfort of his friends, Lars's state of mind began to unravel with terrifying speed. The carefree holidaymaker was gone, replaced by a man gripped by a burgeoning and inexplicable paranoia. His behavior grew erratic, tinged with a fear that seemed to come from nowhere. The hotel's CCTV cameras, silent, unblinking witnesses, captured fragments of his distress. The footage shows him pacing the hallways, peering anxiously out of windows as if searching for a pursuer, and at one point, strangely, hiding inside an elevator. At some point during that long, lonely night, he made a phone call. It was to his mother, Sandra Mittank, back in Germany. But this was not a normal call. He spoke in a frantic whisper, his voice trembling with a terror she could not comprehend. He told her that 4 men were after him. "They are trying to kill or rob me," he whispered across the miles, his panic palpable even through the strained connection. He urged her to cancel his credit cards immediately. He also sent her a text message, asking about the medication the doctor had prescribed. Sometime after 1 a.m., he abruptly left the hotel, vanishing into the night for over an hour. Where he went and what he did during that time remains a complete mystery. When he returned, his agitation had not subsided. The following morning, July 8th, he called his mother again. The people who were after him, he told her, were getting closer. Despite his apparent terror, Lars knew he had to get home. That morning, he made his way to Varna Airport, the final, fateful stage of his journey. He even texted his mother to let her know he had arrived at the terminal. His plan was to consult with the airport physician, get clearance to fly, and board the next available plane to Germany. He walked into the medical office and met with Dr. Kostov. Dr. Kostov would later describe Lars as nervous and erratic, his demeanor a world away from that of a typical tourist. Lars seemed jumpy and on edge. The doctor examined his ear and, finding no immediate complications, told him he was fine to fly home. But the reassurance did not calm him. Instead, Lars seemed to grow more agitated, expressing doubts about the antibiotic he had been prescribed. He lingered in the office, his anxiety a thick, tangible presence in the small room. The airport was undergoing renovations at the time, and the background noise of construction was a constant hum. It was into this already tense atmosphere that a construction worker entered the medical office. The man's sudden appearance seemed to be the trigger that shattered Lars's fragile composure. His eyes widened in panic, and he began to tremble uncontrollably. He jumped to his feet and shouted, his voice filled with pure, unadulterated terror. "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." Before Dr. Kostov or the construction worker could react, Lars bolted. He fled the office, leaving everything behind on the floor: his wallet, his mobile phone, his passport, and the backpack that contained all of his worldly possessions. Airport security cameras captured what happened next. The footage, which would later be viewed by millions around the world, is silent, grainy, and deeply chilling. It shows a young man, dressed in a simple t-shirt and shorts, sprinting through the airport terminal with the desperation of someone running for their life. He doesn't look back. He just runs. He bursts through the main entrance and into the bright Bulgarian sun. Without breaking stride, he continues across the forecourt, past the taxis and the travelers milling about. His destination is a high, barbed wire fence that separates the airport grounds from the surrounding countryside. He reaches the formidable barrier and, with a surge of adrenaline, scrambles over it. Once on the other side, he lands in a vast meadow that, at that time of year, was a field of tall sunflowers. He sprints into the dense foliage, his figure receding into the sea of yellow and green until, finally, he disappears from the camera's view. That was the last time anyone ever saw Lars Mittank. The aftermath was a vortex of confusion, fear, and unanswered questions. When Lars failed to return home, his family's anxiety turned to dread. His mother, Sandra, armed with the memory of his terrifying phone calls, immediately knew something was horribly wrong. She began a relentless search for her son, a quest for answers that would consume her life. The Bulgarian authorities launched an investigation, but there was little to go on. A man had vanished in broad daylight, on the grounds of an international airport, yet there were no witnesses to what happened after he ran into the forest. The area was searched, but the vast, dense landscape yielded no clues. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed him whole. Sandra Mittank hired a private investigator, Andreas Gudig, who scoured Bulgarian hospital records for unidentified patients, hoping to find a man who had perhaps lost his memory. The search was fruitless. With no official answers, speculation rushed in to fill the void. Numerous theories, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish, emerged, each attempting to explain Lars's bizarre behavior and his ultimate disappearance. One of the most prominent theories centered on the antibiotic cefprozil. Both German and Bulgarian doctors, as well as Sandra Mittank, considered the possibility that Lars had suffered a rare psychotic side effect from the medication. Certain antibiotics have been known to induce symptoms like hallucinations, paranoia, and extreme anxiety, which would align perfectly with Lars's whispered phone calls and his terrified flight from the airport. However, this theory was complicated by Dr. Kostov, the airport physician, who later claimed that Lars had not taken the medication at all. He didn't even fill out his prescription, Kostov stated, leaving him utterly confused by Lars's panicked state. If not the medication, then what? Some experts, like mental health counselor Dr. Todd Grande, suggested that Lars might have experienced a first-break psychosis, the sudden onset of a previously undiagnosed mental illness like schizophrenia, potentially triggered by the stress and trauma of the assault. Another, more sinister theory posited that Lars's paranoia was not a delusion. Perhaps he really was in danger. The argument in the bar, the subsequent beating, could it have been connected to something more serious than a football rivalry? Online sleuths and armchair detectives have long suspected that the men he fought with were still after him, and that his desperate run from the airport was a genuine attempt to escape a real threat. This theory would explain his fear, but it raises other questions. If they were pursuing him, did they catch him in the forest? And if so, why was no body ever found? Some have speculated about deeper criminal involvement, perhaps drug trafficking, that would explain a professional and clean disappearance, but no evidence has ever surfaced to support this. There is also the heartbreaking possibility that Lars, perhaps suffering from amnesia induced by his head injury or a psychotic break, is still alive somewhere, lost and unaware of his own identity. This is the hope his mother, Sandra, clings to. She believes he is out there, homeless and in need of her help. Over the years, this hope has been periodically kindled by alleged sightings. Shortly after he vanished, a truck driver in Varna reported seeing a hitchhiker who resembled Lars. Years later, in 2019, another truck driver in Germany claimed to have given a ride to a man from Dresden who looked like an older version of Lars, with long hair, a beard, and tired, sunken eyes. Each lead, however, has ultimately gone cold, leading back to the same agonizing uncertainty. In the years since he vanished, the case of Lars Mittank has taken on a life of its own, transforming from a personal family tragedy into a global internet phenomenon. Yet, despite the global attention, the private investigators, and the tireless efforts of his mother, the mystery remains as profound and impenetrable as it was on that hot July day in 2014. The truth of what happened to Lars Mittank seems to be locked away in the very forest he ran into, somewhere beyond the field of sunflowers. Was he running from a real enemy, or from the phantoms of his own mind? Did he meet with a terrible fate in the woods, or did he somehow escape, only to lose himself in a different way? For his family, and especially for his mother, the lack of an answer is a unique form of torment. There's a good chance he'll come back, Sandra has said, her hope a defiant flame against the encroaching darkness of the years. He just needs my help. Her search continues, a testament to a mother's unwavering love in the face of an incomprehensible void. The story of Lars Mittank is not just a mystery. It is a tragedy of a life interrupted, a story that ends not with a period, but with a haunting, unanswered question mark, suspended forever in the grainy footage of a young man running, until he simply ran out of sight. Story 8. The vast, flat expanse of the Canadian prairie stretches to the horizon under a sky that feels both immense and oppressive. In the heart of this landscape lies Winnipeg, a city of stark contrasts, where brutal winters give way to fleeting, glorious summers. In the quiet, leafy suburb of Westwood, on a street named Coleridge Park Drive, life for the Gibson family seemed to be a picture of sun-dappled contentment. Their home was a neat, two-story house, the kind with a well-tended lawn and a basketball hoop in the driveway, a symbol of middle-class aspiration and domestic tranquility. From the outside, Lisa Gibson had everything a young mother could want. At 32, she was bright and accomplished, a woman who had built a life with her husband, Brian, that was filled with love and promise. Her Facebook page was a curated gallery of happiness, a testament to a life lived in the warm glow of familial affection. There were pictures of her 2-year-old daughter, Anna, a vibrant, smiling toddler with a shock of blonde hair and an infectious spirit. The last public post from mid-June 2013 was a picture of Anna captioned simply, "Man, I love this kid." In late April, the family had welcomed a new addition, a baby boy named Nicholas. The online album grew, filled with images of a seemingly blissful family of four. A proud father, a doting mother, and two beautiful children. But social media is a canvas for illusion, a place where the messy, complicated truths of life are cropped out, leaving only the smiling, sunlit moments. Behind the digital facade of Lisa Gibson's life, a darkness was gathering. It was an insidious, creeping shadow, a malady of the mind that is as old as motherhood itself, yet remains shrouded in stigma and misunderstanding. Lisa was suffering from postpartum depression, a condition that was slowly, inexorably pulling her under, into a world of anxiety, fear, and despair that no one on the outside could truly see. The birth of a child is meant to be a time of joy, but for many women, it is a biological and emotional crucible. The wild hormonal fluctuations, the profound sleep deprivation, the immense, crushing weight of responsibility for a fragile new life. It can be a perfect storm for the mind. For Lisa, the storm was particularly violent. In the weeks and months following Nicholas's birth, the vibrant, happy woman her family knew began to recede, replaced by a stranger, a hollowed-out version of herself, haunted by a sadness she could not name and a fear she could not articulate. Her neighbors noticed the change. They would see her in the neighborhood, but she was never alone with her children. She was always accompanied by an older woman, likely her mother or mother-in-law, a constant, watchful presence. One neighbor recalled seeing her at a stop sign, her car idling, her eyes fixed in a blank, unsettling stare. "She'd just be staring at you. I thought it was kind of weird," the neighbor remembered. The woman who had once been an active, engaged part of the community was now a ghost in her own life, a silent, watchful figure on the periphery. Her family was aware of her struggle. They were doing everything they could to support her. In early to mid-July, she was reportedly diagnosed with postpartum depression and prescribed medication. She was seeking treatment, trying to fight her way back to the surface. But the illness had a powerful, relentless grip. It was more than just the baby blues, more than just the exhaustion and worry that all new mothers feel. It was a deep, pathological despair, a chemical imbalance that was warping her perception of reality, twisting her love for her children into something dark and terrifying. On the morning of Wednesday, July 24th, 2013, the fragile peace of Coleridge Park Drive was shattered forever. At around 8 a.m., a well-being call was placed to 911 from the Gibson home. The call was a hang-up, a silent plea for help that spoke volumes. Police were dispatched to the house, a routine call that was about to escalate into a scene of unimaginable horror. The first officers to arrive found a house that was eerily quiet. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious indication of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The details of what happened next would become a matter of intense debate and internal review, but the outcome was brutally clear. Sometime after the police arrived, the children's grandmother, who had also rushed to the scene, made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In an upstairs bathtub, she found the small, still bodies of Anna and Nicholas, unresponsive, submerged in the water. The quiet suburban street erupted into a maelstrom of emergency lights and frantic activity. The children were rushed to the hospital, their tiny bodies victims of a crime that was not yet understood. But it was too late. Anna, the vibrant 2-year-old, and Nicholas, the 3-month-old baby boy, could not be revived. They were pronounced dead. In the chaos and confusion of the initial response, a horrifying realization dawned. Lisa was gone. She had vanished. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse and keys left behind. She had simply disappeared, melting away into the quiet morning, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable tragedy. The police immediately launched a massive search. The investigation was now a desperate two-pronged effort, a hunt for a person of interest in a double homicide, and a search for a missing and likely deeply disturbed woman. The homicide unit took the lead, their presence on the quiet residential street a grim testament to the gravity of the situation. Police taped off the entrance to a park across from the home, and officers fanned out through the neighborhood, their faces grim, their search methodical. As news of the tragedy spread, a wave of shock and disbelief washed over the city. How could this happen? How could a mother, a woman whose life seemed so perfect, be connected to such a horrific event? The police were careful with their language, calling Lisa a person of interest, a term that did little to quell the storm of speculation that was already brewing. They released her photograph, a smiling, happy picture that was a haunting contrast to the dark reality of the day. They pleaded with the public for information, for any sighting of the 32-year-old mother who had disappeared into thin air. The search for Lisa intensified. Tips poured in, sightings of a distraught woman in pajama pants, wandering aimlessly. The focus of the search shifted to the city's rivers, the dark, murky waters of the Assiniboine and the Red, which snaked their way through the heart of Winnipeg. On Friday, July 26th, 2 days after the children were found, police divers began to search the Assiniboine River near the family home. The image of the divers disappearing into the cold, brown water was a powerful symbol of the city's descent into a shared nightmare. That same day, the police confirmed what many had suspected. Lisa had been recently prescribed medication for postpartum depression. The term, once a clinical diagnosis whispered in doctors' offices, was now at the center of a public tragedy. It raised a host of difficult, uncomfortable questions about the nature of motherhood, the fragility of the human mind, and the adequacy of the mental health support systems in place for new mothers. The agonizing wait for news came to a grim end on Saturday, July 27th. The body of a woman was recovered from the Red River, near the Alexander Docks, a commercial and industrial area far from the leafy streets of Westwood. The next day, police confirmed the city's worst fears. It was Lisa Gibson. The search was over. The criminal investigation, however, was just beginning. The police now faced the daunting task of piecing together the events of that terrible morning. They were dealing with a case that was both a double homicide and a suicide, a tragedy born not of malice or greed, but of a profound and devastating mental illness. For more than 2 months, the city waited for answers. The police remained tight-lipped, their investigation hampered by the need for forensic analysis and toxicology reports. They were determined to report only the facts, to avoid the speculation that had consumed the public discourse. Finally, on October 3, 2013, the Winnipeg Police Service held a press conference. The news was what everyone had expected, but it was no less devastating for its inevitability. They officially confirmed that Lisa Gibson had drowned her 2 children before taking her own life. The criminal portion of the investigation was declared closed. The confirmation brought a sense of closure, but it did little to ease the profound sense of sorrow and bewilderment that hung over the city. How could a loving mother be driven to such a desperate act? The answer, as experts and advocates tried to explain, lay in the dark and often misunderstood world of postpartum psychosis. Postpartum psychosis is a rare but severe mental illness that can occur after childbirth. It is not the same as postpartum depression. It is a psychiatric emergency, characterized by a sudden and dramatic break with reality. Sufferers can experience hallucinations, delusions, and paranoid beliefs. In the grip of this illness, a mother's love can be twisted into a terrifying conviction that she must harm her child, either to save them from a perceived terrible fate or because of a delusional belief that they are evil or possessed. It is an illness that strikes without warning, transforming a loving mother into a danger to herself and her children. The Lisa Gibson tragedy became a catalyst for a long-overdue public conversation about maternal mental health. In the wake of her death, calls to mental health hotlines surged. The Mood Disorders Association of Manitoba reported a 10-fold increase in calls, many from concerned fathers who were seeing signs of distress in their partners. The tragedy had torn away the veil of silence that so often surrounds postpartum mental illness, forcing the community to confront a difficult and uncomfortable truth. For Brian Gibson, The husband and father left to navigate an ocean of unimaginable grief. There were no easy answers. He had lost his entire family in a single incomprehensible act of violence born of illness. At the funeral, held on August 1st, a week after the tragedy, his brother, Bill, spoke of the need to remember the joy, to hold on to the happy memories that had been so brutally eclipsed. "It's not all sadness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For me, it's a lot of joy just remembering and appreciating all the times we spent together." That same evening, a candlelight vigil was held at the Forks, a public space at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, near where Lisa's body was found. It was attended mostly by strangers, by members of a community united in grief and a shared sense of loss. The flickering candles were a small, fragile light in the face of an overwhelming darkness, a testament to the city's collective heartbreak. The case of Lisa Gibson is a story without a villain. It is a tragedy in the purest sense of the word, a story of a woman consumed by an illness she did not choose and could not control. It is a story of a family destroyed, of a community shaken, and of a system that, for all its good intentions, failed to prevent a catastrophe. The questions raised by Lisa Gibson's death linger. Was the care she received adequate? Could more have been done to help her? The Winnipeg Regional Health Authority conducted a review and stated that the care she had received followed normal protocols, but the outcome suggests that for some, the normal protocols are not enough. The house on Coleridge Park Drive no longer belongs to the Gibson family. It has been sold, its tragic history a silent, invisible scar on the quiet suburban street. But the memory of what happened there remains, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most perfect of facades. The story of Lisa Gibson is not a story about a monster. It is a story about a mother who was lost, a woman who fell into a chasm of mental illness so deep that it consumed her and her children. It is a story that forces us to confront the devastating reality of postpartum psychosis, to strip away the stigma and the shame, and to recognize it for what it is, a medical emergency that requires a swift, compassionate, and comprehensive response. It is a story that, in its unbearable sadness, carries a desperate, urgent plea, to listen to the silent cries for help, to see the darkness that can gather behind a smiling photograph, and to do everything in our power to ensure that no other family has to endure such a devastating loss. The echoes of that 911 hang-up call, a silent scream from the depths of despair, will forever be a reminder of the day that darkness won.